So, good afternoon, everybody. My name's Dr Udvitha Nandasoma. I'm a medico-legal advisor for the MDU, and I'm really grateful to you for giving up your lunchtime to talk about complaints. My background is in hospital medicine and hepatology. I've worked for the MDU for around 12 years now. So, we'll move on to the webinar very swiftly. A couple of housekeeping things to begin with. That there are some interactive elements to this. We'll have some votes throughout the webinar, and there's also a chat box. I think you'll find it at the top right of your screen. If you press the red arrow, you'll be able to access the chat box and contribute to the webinar. We'll have time for some questions at the end. You're welcome to answer questions throughout, and I'll answer those when I can throughout the presentation as well. I'm conscious that we've got a mix of hospital doctors and doctors in primary care and practice managers as well, and also some doctors in training. And I think that's really excellent, because I frankly knew nothing about complaints processes or procedures until I started to work for the MDU. So some of you will be interested in complaints from having to run your own complaints procedure. So you'll be practice managers or hospital or GPs involved in running a complaints procedure, and some of the webinar hopefully will be relevant to that. Even if you're not, and if your primary interest is in writing a response to a complaint, we'll also address that, but just be aware of the processes going on in the background as well. So without any further ado, I'm going to move on to the presentation. And we'll make a start. So, what I'm going to talk to you about today, sorry you're seeing me again, I'll just get you back onto the webinar. So what I'm going to talk about today is a few things. I'm going to talk about why dealing with complaints is important, and I know that there's a lot of emphasis on complaints. You'll say, look, this isn't kind of something that is controversial now, but I'll explain why it is from a managerial perspective if you're running a practice or as a practitioner as well. I'm going to talk a bit about recognizing complaints, and that again might sound something obvious, but it's something where practices and hospitals can get into trouble when grumbles sort of go along without actually being brought within a complaints procedure. And then I'll talk about actions you should take when you receive a complaint. I'm also then going to talk about how to investigate a complaint. Now, I understand that won't be relevant to all of you, but even those, say, hospital doctors or doctors in training, when you're asked to respond to a complaint, if you have an understanding of this, you may well be able to look at it and say, well, actually, I need to go back to the complaints department and say, I can do this bit, but they need to ask somebody else to deal with another part of this complaint. And then, of course, we'll talk about how to respond to a complaint, and also talk about how to plan for a meeting with a complainant. We know that it's often the case that the complaint letter will end with an offer of a meeting with a complainant, but the point I want to get across is that should really be an active process, so something that you plan for and you know what to expect. And we'll then also talk about what to do if a complaint is not resolved. So I'm going to run through that in terms of the presentation, and I'll also obviously leave some time for questions at the end. We've got a handout coming with a lot of the resources that I'll refer to in this, and also links to further resources on the MDU website and externally as well. We'll try and add to that depending on what comes up today, and hopefully share that with you tomorrow. So, a little bit about why complaints are important. So, the NHS publishes data annually on written complaints. And there were 209,000, give or take, in the NHS between April 2017 and March 2018. Now that might seem a lot, it's 572 a day, but if you think about the number of patient contacts there are in the NHS a day, that really isn't very many. It's a tiny fraction of the total number of NHS episodes. If we look at those figures in primary care, often the complaints are about clinical treatment, but I think the figures about the proportion related to communication and related to staff attitude, behaviour and values is interesting in that often those issues aren't the primary issue in a complaint, but they may be an additional point, and they also might be really relevant to why the complaint arose in the first place. By profession, it won't surprise you to know that that clinicians, doctors and nurses, giving care are the focus of most complaints. But again, all of you in primary care won't be surprised to hear that a significant minority of the complaints are about the administration of the practice or admin staff and receptionists who are obviously dealing with patients on the front line on a day-to-day basis as well. In secondary care, again, communication is an important theme. A significant proportion are, of course, related to patient care and attitude again. And again, medical staff and nursing staff form the majority of those complained about in this sort of context. Now, complaints are stressful and time-consuming, and I want to acknowledge that at the outset, because I talk about these because I think good complaints handling is important. It's important for you if you're complained about, it's important if you're investigating complaints, and it's important for patients as well. But they are stressful for those making complaints and those being complained about. And if you have the responsibility, as you may well do as a partner in a GP practice, for leading a complaints investigation, or as a senior clinician or a clinical lead in a hospital, I know that can also be stressful as well. Why are complaints considered important? Well, you'll know that we as doctors, nurses, have an obligation to respond to patient concerns. That's in the NMC code, it's in the GMC guidance in good medical practice. So we've got a professional obligation to deal properly with complaints. Those of you involved in running a department or running a surgery will be familiar with the stress of CQC inspections, and you'll also know how important the CQC considers you being able to demonstrate that you can deal with and act on patient feedback, and it's a statutory requirement through that. It can be a source of learning and drive service improvement. I think I would regard that as being somewhat of a holy grail. It's something which has been an ambition in the NHS to learn from complaints, etc. And I know we do that from the complaints we receive. The way it's implemented and the systematic use of that data still could be improved, and obviously there are other ways in which you'll all work to improve services separate from a complaint. The first important concept I really want to get to you is that this presentation and the advice you'll get if you ring us about a complaint will be based on the statutory requirements. Some of you may, or most of you, I would imagine, have never seen this document, but it's to say that the complaints in the NHS are managed under a statutory framework, and these are the regulations in England, and of course there are separate regulations in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland which are similar but do have some important differences. Again, there's information on the MDU website that's specific to each of the jurisdictions. I want to focus mainly on the England regulations today. So these are the first of the interactive parts of the webinar. I'm going to ask you to answer true or false to this question. Something need not be treated as a complaint when a complaint has no basis and is clearly unreasonable. If you vote true or false on that, and we'll see what you think as the audience. So excellent. Thank you very much for voting there. I can see that 93% of you have voted that this is false, and of course that's the case. And it may be frustrating, but essentially this is NHS England's definition of a complaint in their own complaints policy, and that is simply a complaint or concern is an expression of dissatisfaction about an act, omission or decision of NHS England, so substitute your own place of work for that, either verbal or written, whether justified or not, which requires a response. So very simply, a complaint is any expression of dissatisfaction requiring a response. Now, that doesn't mean that if the complaint is unreasonable, you must uphold the complaint or agree with the complainant. It simply means that where a complaint is put and it needs a response, it should be handled in accordance with your normal policy. So, I've got another very quick vote here. True or false? All formal complaints must be made in writing. So great, thank you very much for voting there. I can see that 2/3 of you voted false and 1/3 true. This is a thing that comes up on the MDU advice line quite a lot, and the emphasis that I want to make is that the complaints regulations, the front page of which I showed you before, split complaints into two categories. There can be oral complaints resolved within 1 working day to the satisfaction of the complainant. Those, for want of a better word, can be considered informal. So if someone has a concern, you're able to resolve it, then it should be logged, but it needn't fall within the complaints regulations that I put up before. Anything else, a written or an oral complaint not resolved within a day, are formal and fall under those regulations which I showed you before, so they need to be handled in accordance with them. So the practice point about that is that all staff who interact with patients must be able to recognise a complaint and must be able to know what to do when they get that. So if you're operating a practice or a department, it's good to empower the people you work with to resolve concerns that they can quickly and promptly, and to resolve matters whenever they can, but also know when something is perhaps outside the scope of complaints that they should usually deal with and what might need a full investigation and response. So just bear that in mind. Staff should also know what to do with oral complaints. So if you're in a primary care and somebody comes up to the reception desk and wants to make a complaint, in general terms, I'd discourage you from saying, look, can you write in? If they want to say, I'm going to submit something in writing, that's absolutely fine. But in general, you should take a note of the complaint and ask the patient to confirm or sign that that is accurate. So before we move on to the rest of the webinar, I want to use a really simple complaint to try and illustrate this. So I'm going to put out a really basic clinical scenario, and I've picked this one because it has a GI flavour, and that's kind of the area of work of my clinical practice. But don't focus too much on the clinical aspects of the complaint. I want to try and illustrate how one should approach a complaint of this type. So these are the points of the complaint. Complainant first says, I've been discharged from hospital having had an operation to remove a bowel cancer which has left me with a stoma. And their question is, I want to know why I wasn't referred urgently when I had constipation back in March and saw the doctor. And if I had, I might not be in my 40s with a stoma bag. They also say the district nurses are helping, but she's struggling with the stoma appliances and a repeat prescription, and was not happy with an interaction with a receptionist when they telephoned the practice. And they had to make an emergency appointment for this to be resolved when it could have been done over the phone in the patient's opinion. So think about that. So it's essentially a young patient who's had life-changing surgery, who's got a concern about their care at the practice and a subsequent interaction when they attended the surgery for wanting some stoma dressings. So the first thing when you receive that complaint, I'm sure all of you would know, whether you're in primary or secondary care, that the organisation needs to acknowledge the complaint. The question I have for you is, do you proactively contact complainants to discuss how you plan to approach their complaint? So we're going to open up a vote now, and let's see how you approach things. So great, thank you very much. I can see approximately 3/4 of you have answered that question, and that you know, sometimes will even organise a meeting with a complainant at that stage. So if we go back to that, of course, the complaints regulations require that complaints are acknowledged within 3 working days, but they also include some requirements as to what must go in that initial contact. So I'm going to ask you to use your chat buttons now and just let me know what you think should go in the acknowledgement letter. So if I can put it over to you to let me have some input on what you would normally put in an acknowledgement letter, and then we'll go through this process first, because I think this is a really crucial time in dealing with a complaint, whatever sector you're in. So I've got a thanks there to say, yes, you know, thank the patient for bringing concerns to your attention. That can be really important in terms of it can help somebody know that you're not going to disadvantage them through the complaint. You've got a summary and a detail of the complaint. I think that's really important, particularly for those oral complaints where you may not have subsequently got them in writing. You want to know with the complainant that you're talking about the same thing. We've got expected timeframes, exactly, and we've got negotiated timescale, which I think is really important, and I'll come on to that later. And you said plan of action and timescales, yes, I think that's all really, really important as well. An outline of processes, including timelines when next to be in touch and what investigations you're doing. So yes, I think that's important. We've also got what to do if they're not happy with the response. That could go in your acknowledgement, and I know a lot of people will send out practice literature which has got that in it, but you could also include that later. So first of all, thank you for so many responses. That's really great that to see those coming through. So as I say, the acknowledgement must be done within 3 working days. It must give the complainant an opportunity to discuss how the complaint will be investigated and when a response will be issued. Now remember, this isn't an opportunity to discuss the substantive issues in the complaint as such. It's not like a resolution meeting, but it's just an opportunity to discuss how the complaint will be investigated and how you'll be dealing with that. However, I would encourage you to think of acknowledgement as, you know, 50% of the complaint work. Maybe that's a slight exaggeration, but I want you all to think really hard when you get a complaint. You know, think about, firstly, how you're going to investigate it. Think about whether there are any other organisations involved that you'll need to engage with, try and resolve the complaint. And once you go through that process, you're ready to put together that acknowledgement letter. And we do still sometimes see really brief letters like this. We're sorry you felt the need to complain. We'll respond to your concerns within 10 days. Well, there are some problems with that, are there? On the one hand, it may seem, you know, that you're not sorry to hear of the concerns, but they've actually made a complaint. You've also set a timescale of 10 days, which certainly in England isn't a statutory timescale. The statutory requirement is to respond in a timely fashion and to keep the complainant updated of the progress of your complaint response. So a better option might be to, as a lot of you have said here, to be sympathetic about suffering, to acknowledge why the person has got that concern, to explain what you think the main concern is, and you know, you can summarize that if it's not clear in the complaint letter. You could also use it as an opportunity to illustrate that the patient's care at the practice will not be affected. You can also offer them an opportunity to meet. I know that some of you will pick up the phone to the complainants and talk about it as soon as the complaint comes in and explain all these things. That's really excellent, and you can follow that up with a letter. And you can tell them what to expect, so when they may expect a response and how you're going to update them in that period of time. So it's an opportunity, really, to clarify what the complaint's about, particularly for those oral complaints where there may be a bit of doubt about what's going on. You can also use that as an opportunity to deal with issues of consent. Now, we know that sometimes complaints are brought by relatives or carers. And they can do that with the patient's authority. They may be able to do that on the part of a patient who's died or who lacks capacity. But if there are consent issues to be sorted out, you can deal with those then, whilst being really clear it's not going to delay your investigation, and that's proceeding in any event, but you're resolving these so you can respond appropriately. Again, you're managing expectations about when the response will be issued, and you're working in an agreement, and I can see that in a lot of the comments that many of you referred to negotiating a time frame, and I think that's really sensible. So we've talked about acknowledgement, and I'm going to talk about how you might investigate a complaint. Let's look at the letter again. So this is just to refresh it in your mind. It's a straightforward complaint, and I know there'll be some that you get which will be far more complicated, and I think as a practice point, looking through those letters with a highlighter and a marker and really dissecting those, you know, the really long letters or the handwritten letters which can be difficult to follow, that can be really helpful so you can summarize the complaint and agree that what the key things are. So now you've refreshed your memory about that complaint. What investigative steps might you take? Again, do you want to comment in the chat box and let me know what sort of things you might need to do to investigate this complaint, and I'll let you know what I think in really simple terms. So we've got review of notes, excellent. Look through the history, yeah. See when the patient came to the surgery, look through notes, discuss with the clinician involved, yeah. Talk to the senior partner. I think that raises an important point, and I'll bring that about. Excellent. So and we've got find the facts, look at the practice policies, was treatment following guidelines, talk to the physicians involved, discuss with the clinician. So I think that's a really excellent plan to approach this. So here you've got a few issues here, aren't you? You've got an issue from the receptionist, so you'll need to get an account from the receptionist. You've got to get an account from the doctor concerned, and I'm talking about this in much less detail than you've explained here, in terms of how you're looking at this. And then I think you need to review the clinical management, and many of you have talked about that, talking about reviewing guidelines related to the complaint, looking at policies, reviewing with the senior partner, and I'll come on to those sorts of things because they can be difficult, particularly in primary care. So I think the challenge here is twofold. The first thing that you've all really got to is that you need to establish the facts, establish a timeline, yes, give a chronological account. So you need to work out what happened. You need to review the notes. You've then got a far more difficult question of trying to address whether everything was done properly and how can you show that the complaint was looked at objectively. Now, in large practices in hospitals, you may be able to do that by asking an independent clinician to look at the care and to comment on it. You can always look at it as a significant event or a case review, but there are some ways where I think the simple things you can do to show that you're looking at these things independently, or as independently as you can do, given the restrictions that we have in terms of the resources available for dealing with complaints. To think about it in, the most simple terms is try and establish what should have happened and compare this with what did happen. And a lot of you have made allusions to that. You talked about seeing whether there was delay, etc., whether the referral should have been made, etc. So you're trying to see what did happen. You're trying to work out what should have happened. Also, and this is perhaps talking more about the complaint about the receptionist, many of you will deal with concerns where the patient says one thing happened, a member of staff may say another thing happened, and it's impossible for you to absolutely resolve what happened in that situation if you are charged with investigating a complaint and you're doing so independently. it's important to then try and be as objective as possible and give equal weight to what the complainant says to as to what your staff says. Now, clearly, there may be circumstances where you've got call recordings, where you've got clinical notes, where it's fairly plain what happened, and you can determine those. On the other hand, there may be other circumstances where you can't resolve it, and I guess what I'm trying to say is it's perfectly reasonable to set out both accounts and say you can't resolve the issue directly, but it's probably not going to be assessed as reasonable if the complaint escalates. If you were to say, well, I'm accepting this account because my member of staff says that, and they just wouldn't have done what you have said. The other top tip I can give you in this context is try and show that you've applied objective criteria to the clinical issues. And a lot of you have sort of suggested this here in terms of looking at policies, guidelines, the local referral criteria. And again, you've spoken in terms about the process of repeat prescription. You're going to be able to point to the repeat prescription policy or the policy for dealing with what the patient called with and how that should have been resolved. So these are really difficult because often the complaints may be about people who you know to be good and who you know that you're working with every day. But if you're in the process of investigating a complaint, you need to make, to use these strategies to try and show that you've looked at things as objectively as you can. In this sort of case, and I would say we see this much less commonly that we do in complaint responses. I think you're all doing, a pretty good job in dealing with complaints that you send to us for review. But compare what sometimes goes out in complaint responses where it says, look, we've reviewed your practice, and all the doctors agreed they would have done the same as the doctor concerned when you attended first in March. Now, that is helpful insofar as it shows that you've looked at it as a practice, that other people have had input into the complaint, but it still leaves the question as to why do they think that? And a complainant may feel as though they're sort of being fobbed off or that doctors are closing ranks, etc. And in fact, a lot of the time, when you look at the significant event analysis, there's a far more sophisticated analysis behind it, but it hasn't been presented properly in the response or as effectively as it could have been. And for example, in this case, if you were to say, we've reviewed this as a significant event, or the hospital has done an untoward incident investigation, and we've asked whether you should have been referred under the 2-week wait rule, we've consulted the NICE guidance, this states that somebody presenting in their 40s can be referred urgently if these criteria applied. When you came, your symptoms were of constipation, etc. So you've got, the point here, you've got, and I've highlighted in red here, you've got an objective criterion, say the NICE guidance or your local cancer referral guidance. You've got what should have happened here in that you've said, look, if you had these symptoms, you should have been referred, and you then compare that to what the patient presented with, so you can give as an objective an account as you can of how you've analysed and looked at that complaint. Now, I know this is not always possible. Not everything fits into guidelines. In other circumstances, it may be a judgment call. There may be a diversity of opinion within the practice. In general terms, I see no problem with that. Actually, if it's expressed in a sensible way, it can really help illustrate that you've had a meaningful discussion about it. And in circumstances where you still have a functioning relationship with that patient and there's still a degree of trust, that can really help resolve matters. So we've talked about acknowledging complaints and investigating complaints. I'm going to talk really briefly about the structure of a response, and because I imagine this is an area where there may be questions arising afterwards, and we will leave some time to discuss those. So I always think of complaint responses as having a beginning, a middle, and an end, and having that structure. And the reason I put this in is not because there's any magic in writing a response, or there's only one good way of writing a response. There are many different ways you can do this effectively. It's just I'm often called by doctors who really just don't know how to begin, and it's often once they start writing, the response kind of writes itself. and it becomes much more difficult. But these are really stressful. You know, when I'm on the receiving end of complaints in my clinical practice, I feel the same. There's that mental block, and it's really difficult to get going. And just having a bit of a structure can really help you with that. So at the beginning, have an appropriate introduction. You know, that can include an expression of empathy. In this case, you could say, look, you know, we're writing to you following your complaint, you know, on this date. We want to say, first of all, how sorry we are that you've been diagnosed with this cancer. We understand why you have concerns about your care, given the surgery that you've had. We have investigated your complaint by doing the following, etc. And you can sort of run into that as a start. So you can have an expression of empathy, an account of how you've investigated the complaint. So you could say here that you've reviewed the clinical notes, that you've taken accounts from the clinicians concerned, consulted the relevant guidelines, and discussed it either as a team or within the practice. In the middle, I think it's really important to explain what happened, to give a really careful chronological account of the clinical care, not cutting and pasting the notes, but giving an explanation of what assessment was made and why those decisions were taken. A lot of you, when I said, look, how would you investigate a complaint? A lot of you have said, look, review the notes, and I can't emphasize how important that is. And I'd say this particularly to hospital doctors and often hospital doctors in training. You may receive a complaint after you've moved on to the next post. It's really, really important that you have access to the notes, even if it means they have to send them to you or you have to travel to that area. I do very occasionally see cases where doctors are referred to the GMC or a further complaints made because it's suggested that they've been dishonest in their complaint response, and almost always that's not the case. They've simply put together a response based on their memory and what they would usually do without having had the opportunity to look at the notes and see exactly what they did. So explain what happened and make sure you do so accurately. After you've done that, and this may seem repetitive, but it is really important, respond to each point in the complaint and give your analysis sort of after that. So here you're going to give a factual account of what happened in the consultation, and then you're going to respond to the point about the delay in referral or the prescription issue. This is particularly important where you're dealing with those difficult complaints where there's a fundamental mismatch between what the complainant thinks happened in the consultation and what you think or know happened there. And in particular when, you know, often we see circumstances where there's been a very difficult consultation with an aggressive patient and they may suggest that it's entirely the fault of the doctor, etc., who obviously has a very different view. I think, again, giving a really clear account of what happened is really important, because otherwise, as things go on, the only really detailed account you've got is your own note, which is often not quite as detailed as you might want it to be. And so having a factual account from your perspective of what happened in that consultation is really, really important. You can, of course, include learning points or practice changes, and in fact, it's a statutory requirement in the complaints regulations that the report sent to the complainant, by report they mean response letter sent to the complainant after you've had a complaint, should include the practice points or changes that are resulting from the complaint. And those can actually be quite powerful in terms of illustrating things have been taken seriously. There are 2 points that are really important that I'd make about that. Firstly, if you indicate you're going to make some changes or implement them, then make sure they're done in a timely fashion. There are times where we sometimes see a complainant going to the Ombudsman following a complaint where they're not satisfied with the outcome of. The Ombudsman may write to you several months later, and if those changes still haven't been implemented, that can cause some difficulty. The other thing is that when you include learning points, really take care to make them meaningful. I would really discourage you from putting points in to say, look, we're going to make changes to stop this happening again, because people generally tend to see behind that and see that it's not specific. And of course, sometimes there may not be learning points, or there may be some superficially attractive changes that you say, look, we've considered doing these things, but we're not able to for other reasons, because maybe they will have knock-on effects that cause a problem. There are also some things that you need to discharge at the end of your response. You need to explain to complainants what they can do if they remain dissatisfied. You can offer a meeting with a complainant, and I'm going to talk about how to look at meetings with complainants in the next few slides. But think about the circumstances where that's appropriate. There may be some, in 90% of cases it may be entirely appropriate. There may be some where there's a fundamental issue of aggressive behaviour on the complainant, where you may feel it's not safe or that it's not productive, where you don't offer that. All complainants must be advised of their right to seek review from the Ombudsman, and that needs to go in your final response. If you're a hospital doctor, that will be no doubt taken care of by the hospital complaints department when they put the letter together. If you're in primary care, you must make sure those details are in the final response. So I'm going to talk a little bit about meetings with complainants. I would again say that the key to this is being proactive. You know, often people put an invitation to a meeting as a standard thing in their complaints response. I really don't discourage you from doing that, but if someone says, yes, I'd like to meet, try and do some preparation for that meeting. Think about why you're having that meeting and ask what remains unresolved. There may be some issues where a face-to-face explanation would be really helpful. There may be some where the fundamental issue is that the complainant does not believe what your response says, and you're at an impasse. Now, it can still be appropriate to meet to try and rebuild some trust, etc. But you would, in those circumstances, I'd suggest try and manage that expectation to say, look, we'll discuss those things, but the issue seems to be that you don't believe there's a response, and we may not be able to take that further. So think about why, and then ask the basic sort of questions of when and where. So when you do the why, it will hopefully allow you to formulate an agenda, work out how much time you need for this, and when will be mutually convenient for you and the complainant, and have that at an appropriate venue. And also think about who should be there. The patient may want to bring a supporter. You may want to have all the personnel involved, or a selection of them who were involved in the clinical care or the receptionist, etc. And I'd also encourage you to have a note taker, and also think about whether you need somebody to in effect chair the meeting, or to make sure that there's somebody who's not perhaps directly the subject of the complaint, who can maybe manage the meeting and make sure that you get through the things that you've agreed to discuss in the time. The note taker is important, and I'll come on to that later. But again, I'll say, look, you know, before a meeting, make sure you're prepared, make sure you know what issues will be discussed, the duration of the meeting, the venue, etc. Put all that in writing to the complainant before you have the meeting, so everybody has the same expectations. There are also some things you need to do after a meeting. You need to summarise the discussion in a letter, and reiterate what the complainant can do if they remain dissatisfied. Now, I often have doctors say, well, look, we sorted it out. We don't really want to write to them again or send them the minutes because it may reopen the process. And I accept there's absolutely a risk of that. The problem arises if you've got a complainant who might be prone to do that. The fact that you haven't shared the minutes at the time, given them an opportunity to comment on them or to correct any factual errors, means that their kind of utility is a bit less later on in the process. If, say, you know, the Ombudsman is doing a review and you're required to share your complaints file, you know, if a complainant disputes what was discussed at that meeting, it's a little harder to sort of rely on your minutes then if they've not been shared and agreed, or at least that you've not summarised the discussion afterwards. So I'd certainly still encourage you to do that. I'm going to talk about the Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman just at the last few minutes now before I open this up to questions. Complainants can seek review of unresolved complaints related to NHS-funded care. So this may be hospital complaints, primary care complaints, or treatment given in the private sector under NHS funding, so waiting list initiative or choose and book surgery done in places may still fall under these proceedings. The thing you've got to remember about an Ombudsman's review is that it looks at both the clinical care and the complaints handling. So what happened clinically, but also how the complaint was dealt with, would be looked at. if you are a body handling complaints, so if you're an NHS trust or if you're a general practice, they usually give you an opportunity to comment on their intention to investigate. Now, in general terms, the Ombudsman has a low threshold for investigation. If you can reasonably show that all that proper efforts have been extended and the Ombudsman takes a view that little more can be done at that point, they may elect not to. You are then also given an opportunity to comment on the draft report the Ombudsman produces. That may turn up several months or even a year after the complainant approaches the Ombudsman. If you're an individual clinician who's criticised in that report, you're also given an individual opportunity to comment. And this I say in particular to those of you moving practices with a complaint active at the Ombudsman, or to doctors in hospitals moving to different organisations. Make sure the complaints department have got your contact details and maintain some contact with them and ask them, you know, how the process is going if you're aware of an Ombudsman's complaint, because otherwise it can come to you quite late in the day and kind of add to the stress of dealing with this process. So the Ombudsman can then publish an outcome with some recommendations. These include recommendations for apology. They can include remedial actions, which is why I think if you've said you're going to take action following a complaint, they're really important. The Ombudsman can also recommend financial remedy, though that's relatively rare. It does happen from time to time. If you're faced with an Ombudsman's case, seek advice. Tell NHS Resolution if you're in primary care, because you're required to now if there's an Ombudsman's case. And as I say again, make sure you've done what you said you would do in the response. We've got a question here that says, are Ombudsman's reports accessible to the wider public? They can be. The Ombudsman has got a power to name and shame. They can lay a report before Parliament. They also publish reports on their website. That doesn't tend to be on a name and shame basis, but they often tend to name the organisation. Now, that might be that may, you know, not affect you as an individual if you're working in a large teaching hospital, but it may sort of, you know, obviously identify a practice. So yes, and we know it's the Ombudsman's intention to publish more of their findings. So I'm going to open this up to questions very soon, but my take-home messages there are, look, analyse complaints carefully. When you get that complaint, look at it, break it down, see what the elements are, think what steps you'll take, and think carefully about the process of acknowledgement. Investigate objectively. I still think it's a really good thing that we have control over complaints to some degree. But I think we need to also show that we've looked at these objectively and structure your response and make a plan for meetings when you have them, and also understand what an Ombudsman's investigation involves. So there are some resources for complaints handlers I'd point you to. So if you're involved regularly in managing complaints, I'd encourage you to look at My Expectations for Raising Concerns and Complaints. These will be in the handout that we send to you, and just be mindful of that, because the Ombudsman is actually in the process of creating a complaint standards framework, which will all be judged against. They will put that out for public consultation in the spring, and it will be based on that document. I'll also include a web link to Good Complaint Handling, which actually is one of the more practical documents the Ombudsman produces about how you can show objective complaint handling. And I'll put you a link to some complaints and resources here. So I can see a few questions coming through. I will deal with these as best as possible. First, I want to deal with one we had by email before, which was really in relation to the documentation of safety netting in medical records. And I think that relates to the wider question of, look, how do you deal with notes that you wish were better whenever you get a complaint? And that applies to almost all of us, frankly. You can refer to your normal practice. You can explain what you would normally do, what your safety netting advice meant. But you must be clear that that's what you're doing in a complaint response, that you're being clear that it's actually, you're relying on your recollection rather than the notes. Clearly, with anything, the more specific the safety netting advice is done, the better, and more you can rely on it. But it's not the end of the world. You know, there is a context to all these things. So looking at the complaints coming through, we've got, is it appropriate to suggest an independent advocate and the Ombudsman? There are two separate things. So suggesting an independent advocate is something which you're encouraged to point people to at the beginning of the complaints process. So, you know, having written information about how they can get support with making a complaint. Yes, so, you know, it's appropriate to do that. You can do that at any stage of the complaints process, but be really clear that independent review is with the Ombudsman. So if they're not happy with the outcome of your local resolution of the complaint, that's to go to the Ombudsman. It's not the role of NHS England, it's not the role of an independent advocate. And so be really clear in separating those things. We've got here, we said we're going to discuss complaints in SEA, but didn't go ahead. How can we explain this in the response letter that was discussed informally? I think this is difficult, but I think you can set out what the informal response is, but be clear that it wasn't, you know, that it was discussed informally and these are what the thoughts are. And if you would go ahead and document that more later on, I think that's a reasonable approach. It is obviously difficult when you've not done something you said you might, but there is a way to approach that. Oh, now we've got a really good question about complaints and comments posted on practice website. Can they be removed from the website? I think it depends. You know, clearly you're not required to tolerate abusive or personal comments on the website. In general, what I'd suggest is that you respond to that where you can without breaching patient confidence. So if it's about a generic issue and you explain what's being done, say if it's about the appointment system and you've restructured it, you may be able to put something on that. And then you can obviously invite that person to use your complaints procedure to discuss anything that is personal or so I said, how would you handle a complaint from a patient's partner who's banned from the surgery by the police for threatening behaviour? Well, firstly, you will need the agreement of the patient for him to make the complaint. If he's made the complaint, I think you can respond to it objectively. So if there are points in the complaint relating to that person's care, that's fine, you can deal with that. This is a sort of circumstance where I think you could frankly say that you're not agreeing, you know, going to organise a meeting with him in that sort of context. So do you always say apology even any mistakes been done? I think that means, do we always suggest an apology even where there have been no mistakes? And I would say no. You can give an expression of empathy, you can sympathise with the circumstances. If you don't think there's an apology due, then I would take the approach of explaining sensitively why you think the care was appropriate. What I'd really avoid is those conditional apologies, which are non-apologies. You know, I'm sorry if you feel that. Those things tend to wind up complainants. So I think where an apology is due, give an emphatic and clear apology. Where you think not, give a real explanation as to why you think the care was appropriate. So in rare conditions, no clear guidelines or accepted practice. I think that's difficult. You can acknowledge the rarity, you can explain, you know, the difficulties in knowing the right way forward. There may be experts in that field who are involved in the condition, you can talk to them about that. They may be able to provide some input, but that's kind of, I go that. You say vexatious complainants in the last 2 years, we were keen to get to the Ombudsman. It was clear it was a relief. Was this a good idea to encourage engagement? Was it better earlier rather than later? The first thing I'd say is that vexatious complainants aren't easy to deal with. The best you can do is to separate the issues that are simply vexatious and not get caught out by not dealing with the serious issues of complaint. You know, you are required to tell complaints about their right to approach the Ombudsman, and they can be reasonably good at dealing with vexatious complainants, but they will be really forensic about it. So if there is something in the midst of a 10-page vexatious complaint that is important and should have been dealt with, can guarantee the Ombudsman will probably pick that up. They will address that, we're reassured, in their complaint handling framework, so we'll see what that shows. And we've got a comment here saying, we found having a call recording has been very helpful, any complaints received. Both sides of the story, that's absolutely right. I know that a lot of you are quite understandably really worried about being recorded, both in calls or surreptitiously. But often that's actually, you know, actually more helpful than harmful. So we've got, what is the role of discussion with a senior partner in general practice? I'd use senior partner here as a longhand. There are a number of statutory roles set out by the complaints regulation. So a complaint, and a general practice, you've got to have somebody who's the responsible person for complaints. Now that person must be a partner in the practice. They can be a management partner, but they must be a partner. They can delegate the role of complaints manager to somebody else, often the practice manager. So the person who's responsible for complaints should oversee the running of the complaints process. They may sign off all the responses. There may be a separate clinical role. If you've got a senior clinician who's separate from those doctors complained about, showing that the complaint's been reviewed by them can be helpful. Say time management is a reason for general dissatisfaction in patients. I'm not quite clear what that means. I presume it's the pressure of time. There's no real simple answer to that. Often it relates to appointment systems and things like that, and different practices manage that differently. I'd probably encourage you to talk to the LMC or other people in your region, see what they get work. As far as I can see, they each have pros and cons, and it's very difficult. And I think otherwise, it's not wrong to explain that there was a time pressure that might have been relevant to the complaint. The only thing I would be careful about there is being clear about whether you think that time pressure had an impact in that case. If you think it did, acknowledge that. If you think it didn't, but you just happened to be busy that day, I'd think carefully about including that. So we've got here GP related complaints, mentioned behaviour like looking at the screen while they're looking, etc. I think, and the question there is, should a response include the details of interaction dynamics during the consultation? I think absolutely. You know, often we get the doctor was looking at the screen, but that's because you've got a 7-minute appointment and you've got to do multiple things in that. And absolutely, you can explain that. You can apologise for the time pressure. If you've tried setting up, I had one response that I think was really good, where the doctor said, "Look, I've tried setting up the room in these different ways to try and focus my attention on you. None of them have been ideal," and that's really helpful. And so we've got here, hearing minor verbal complaints and patient relating suboptimal communication and consultation with senior colleagues, others verbally acknowledging and apologising for their experience, want to do much else. As far as I know, it keeps coming. Any advice? I mean, I guess the thing is, have you been able to take this up either with the relevant partner, clinical lead, if you're not in a position to talk to your colleague directly? If you've got a good relationship with your colleague, that's not wrong. But I can imagine that there are some circumstances where may be different. And we've got a comment here, and on NHS choice is difficult. They don't leave names, so we have a generic response saying getting in touch via a complaints procedure. I think that's right. I went to a talk given by NHS England recently where they were showing some examples where people had gone a little bit further in terms of dealing with NHS choices reviews. I think you've got to be really careful there that you're not commenting on individual cases. There are some general gripes about systems and processes, usually about appointments, etc. Then you may be able to be a bit more expansive if a change has been made. Otherwise, inviting someone to get in touch, showing everybody else who's reading that review that you are willing to deal with gripes, etc. I think that's sensible. So does a clinician need to respond to their own complaints, or does the response need to come to the practice complaints manager? I'm going to spend a minute on that because I think it's a really important question. You've got to be really clear that there are two responsibilities here. The practice will remain responsible for the handling of that complaint. So ultimately, the complaints process, making sure a response is issued to the complainant, all of that should come from the practice. And if it's a personal letter from the clinician, it should usually come with a covering letter from the practice where you can deal with things like the right to go to the Ombudsman, organising a meeting, etc. Whether a clinician should respond to their own complaint in personal terms or whether it should be a more corporate response rather than just with a covering letter, I think you'd make a judgment on that based on the complaint. Some complaints are often ones where they've got a real gripe with the clinician, or they've had a really good relationship with the clinician, but something's not gone quite right and they're upset by that. And sometimes a personal response can be worth 100 corporate responses in those. So I think use your judgment in terms of exactly what goes to the complainant in terms of that letter, but remember that it's the practices or the hospital's complaint, and it should if you're taking that route, come with something else that focuses on that. So when patients comment on a practice website used by CQC, how do you respond to that? The thing that the CQC will be really interested in is how you deal with those concerns. So if you can show to the CQC that you welcome feedback, that even where you've only been able to tell them, look, use our complaints procedure because you've not identified yourself, if you show that you've taken action as a result of that, or you've investigated it and find that that was founded, that's really sensible. You know, knowing that the claim industry is pushing good practitioners to give up the profession, what is the NHS doing to prevent the decline of the medical profession? Well, I mean, that is a question for another webinar, and say that the MDU has been engaging with government for quite some time to try and deal with fair compensation. Fundamentally, the only way that will come will be through a process of tort reform, pursuing claims proportionate to the issues, limiting legal fees, etc. We will continue to campaign for that. So after an informal complaint which has been resolved, do you have to write to the patient to summarise? As I said, if you've got an oral complaint resolved to the patient's satisfaction within 1 working day, no, you don't. The second part of the question is, should we still document informal complaints? Absolutely, I would encourage you to do that. So if there are minor issues that you think, you know, you can do that, etc. Now, the next question I'm also going to spend a minute on is the question here about can serial complainers be removed from a practice list, breakdown of the relationship? Possibly, but there are a couple of things I'd say about that. Firstly, when you have a case like that, call us or write into us for advice, because certainly when I advise, I say, look, only you can be the judge of whether your relationship has broken down, but there are all sorts of points of process that need to be done properly, and you need to make sure that everything you've done will be seen as fair, etc. So in that, you'll know that the GMS contract prevents you from removing somebody simply because they've complained. On the other hand, if you've got somebody who can never establish a therapeutic relationship because they are stuck on the issue of complaints, well, that might lead to a breakdown in the relationship. But if you were doing that, I'd want to see that you'd taken steps outside the complaints process to say, maybe have a meeting to say, look, can we talk about this? Can we move on, etc. That you've gone through that process of trying to repair the relationship, responded to the concerns before taking the step of removal. So now we're coming close to time, so I may not be able to get through all the questions, but I'll deal with another one, which is one that always upsets people, and my answer will no doubt upset you on this, which is patients recording consultations or without telling or seeking consent. It is not unlawful for a patient to surreptitiously record a consultation for their own use. Now, I know you won't like that, and unfortunately the case law recently, which related to a case of a recording during actually a surreptitious recording done in the context of a claim, now the judge in that context allowed the patient's recording. So I think the first thing I'd say is I think this must happen all the time. The technology is so obvious, everyone can do that in their, you know, on their phone, so I'm sure it happens all the time, and it isn't illegal. Now, there may be a dispute if they share that more widely, but it's generally not a really helpful thing to engage with. I have to say, in all these cases where there's been a focus on recording during a consultation, that's been one of many other issues, and quite often there have been lots of other objectionable behaviour, which is probably a better route through which you can manage the interaction with the patient. If they are recording, often I would sort of say, look, put the phone on the desk, we'll talk, you know, and they can do that. And we've got a comment here that a vexatious complaint dealt with, referred to the Ombudsman and closed. Yes, I think that's sensible. What point might you suggest medico-legal action? Would you just recommend complaints go to the Ombudsman? The thing to be clear about is the complaints process is separate to the claims process. So the patient may choose to bring a claim at any time, but insofar as the complaints go, I'd usually recommend the Ombudsman. If they make a demand for compensation, yes, I might advise that they, the response says, look, this is a complaints process and they should seek advice on pursuing a claim if that's what they wanted to do. And we've got a comment here saying a verbal complaints log for the reception team. I think that's a really good idea. Now, again, a really good question. What happens when a practice manager gets a complaint? Can he or she respond without the clinician? Well, it's difficult. Often you might be able to when it's about the practice. When it's a personal complaint about what the practice manager has done, what I would suggest is you meet as a practice and you appoint somebody else to actually investigate that. So I think that's that's sort of important. And we've got here duty of candour. If a doctor becomes aware of a mistake, error, how and it should be dealt with. Are you responsible for flagging out your own mistakes or others as well? In terms of incident reporting, I'd say that's a distributed responsibility. If you become aware of an error, then it should be reported. Whether you do that, whether you encourage a colleague to do that, I feel kind of relatively, relaxed about. We're required to tell a patient when something goes wrong. You can make a judgment as to exactly how you do that. Whether you do yourself or a colleague do it, that's fine. The duty of candour is quite a technical thing. It goes beyond the kind of professional duty. We have to be honest with patients, and it helps. It depends on a harm threshold, etc. There's lots of resources on the MDU website for that. So say, when do you refer to professional insurance? So an indemnifier or NHS resolution have been dealing with primary care complaints since 2000 and since April of this year. When they're bringing a claim is really that sort of situation. And to tie on to that, should practices ask the MDU to review all complaints responses? We don't demand you do that. We are more than happy to review anything that you've got a concern about. It's often not possible to know which complaints will escalate, so we encourage you to contact us. But, not that. The final thing I'll deal with, because I think it's a tricky question, which is, how you deal with gripes made about a colleague's, management of a case made during a consultation. I think you can record that objectively in the clinical notes. You can discuss with a colleague afterwards. If it's something said during a consultation, but the patient is unhappy because this was done or the other was done or they weren't referred, I don't see a problem with you recording that in the clinical note. The subsequent analysis of that, if you're going to go away and talk to your colleague and do significant events, etc., I don't think that's necessary for the clinical notes. But I think you can certainly record factually what happens. So I'm sorry if I've not been able to get through all your questions there. We're up to time now. Thank you ever so much for giving up your lunch hour, and we will send a handout tomorrow with the relevant resources there. So thank you so much for giving up your time for us, and I hope that was helpful.